I'm delighted to talk to you today about writing a great politics essay. And I'm going to focus my remarks upon the specific challenges that are distinctive, I would say, to writing a politics essay. So the first of these, of course, is that we're all enmeshed in various ways in the news cycle. You know, we all keep abreast of current affairs. It feels very, very pressing. In many ways, what's going on in the news is informing our scholarly agenda in the ways that Andy has laid out with respect to the developments volume, which is an incredibly valuable volume. But we're not journalists, we're not pundits, and we're trying to get that broader view to sort of articulate models of politics, to understand how American institutions work, how American political behavior works, and I don't know about you, but I sometimes find American politics particularly overwhelming. It feels very intense, it feels very intrusive, and it's difficult sometimes to get some emotional distance to the phenomena that we are investigating. So I think that's one challenge that comes with writing politics essays. And another one, of course, is that unlike more theoretical disciplines or abstract essay writing, like philosophy, for example, in a politics essay, you have to have not only beautiful writing, clear structure, persuasive argument, you also need to marshal empirical evidence. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on that challenge of incorporating empirical evidence into your politics essays. And I'm going to draw upon some of the things that I say in my essay writing guide, Brilliant Essays, which is published with Bloomsbury, and it's aimed at students, undergraduate students, but also those who are interested in studying an essay writing subject as an undergraduate, who are looking forward to undergraduate study. And I'm going to start this question of how to incorporate empirical evidence with a question that was posed by one of my favourite politics tutors when I was an undergraduate, and which I now in turn ask my own students, and that is, of what is this a case and compared to what? Of what is this a case and compared to what? So when we're thinking about the empirical phenomena that we're trying to investigate, the first crucial question that I always ask my students is, of what is this a case? What sort of thing is it that you are investigating? So once you've defined the terms of the question, let's say the question is, why is America's exceptionalism such a double-edged sword? Clearly, you're going to be thinking about this idea of American exceptionalism. And we know, those of us who study American politics, we all know that American exceptionalism has many different manifestations. So it is a statement about America's specialness, perhaps its uniqueness, perhaps its moral goodness, as an exemplar that other countries should follow. It's also a foreign policy doctrine. It's also a statement about American political development and the lack of a socialist party, the conspicuous lack of a large socialist party. It's also a sense about the American projects having distinctive origins and revolutionary origins, or something to do with the distinctiveness about its institutions. So there are many, many different claims about American exceptionalism. It's, on the one hand, it's a political slogan. It's used in speech making to appeal to certain audiences. And we know, of course, that Republicans are more supportive of American exceptionalism, or claims of American exceptionalism, than Democrats are. And you might want to think about why that might be the case. It's, as I say, a foreign policy doctrine. It's a political stance that could motivate political actors to action. And it's an empirical observation that we as political scientists might evaluate respecting political development in the US. So the crucial question, once you're thinking about this, around this term of American exceptionalism, is to think of, what is this a case? What sort of thing is it? Is it a slogan? Is it a doctrine? Is it a stance? Is it an observation? And you could write a wonderful essay about any of these different angles on the question, but each of them is going to lead you in quite a different direction. So the first part of this is, of what is this a case? What is the phenomenon that I'm examining? And the second part is, and compared to what? Because of course, as political scientists, we are in the business of comparison. We're not simply describing what's happened, one thing after another. We are developing concept, we're testing theories, we are advancing arguments about political phenomena that we observe. And so an important part, I think, of thinking about the empirical underpinnings of your essay is to think about your comparator class, what you're comparing with. Because we don't make a claim just in the abstract on its own. We are often implicitly or explicitly comparing. So if the question is, what role does the minority party play in Congress? One technique I tell my students to do, and I find it's very, very helpful when you first get an essay question, is to read it out loud and to think about the emphasis that you place on different words that can illuminate different comparator classes. So if I were to read this question to you and say, what role does the minority party play in Congress? Obviously, that's drawing our attention to the role of the minority party vis-a-vis the majority party. And we might sort of think about what roles are distinctive and where and how they differ from one another, from the majority versus minority. If, on the other hand, I say, what role does the minority party play in Congress? Well, that's taking me in a different direction. Well, we're saying, okay, so we might think about other minority party roles in other legislative bodies, state legislatures, for example, within the US, or even, and I'm a proud graduate of the A-level politics many years ago, and I remember there was a synoptic element there, that there was a cross-national comparison. You might compare, for example, the role of the minority party in Congress vis-a-vis, the UK Parliament or some other legislative body around the world. What if the question is the Constitution still adequate for America's needs? Well, here we could put our emphasis on lots of different words and takes us in very, very different directions in terms of what sort of comparator we're thinking about. So is the Constitution still adequate for America's needs? Takes us into thinking, well, okay, so what about other institutions of American governance, and how does the Constitution stack up vis-a-vis these others? If I say, is the Constitution still adequate for America's needs? Of course, that's a cross-national, cross-temporal comparison, right? So it's sort of thinking, well, now, we're talking about now, but compared to what period in the past? And it's very important for us to have the temporal scope conditions of our argument clear. Over what period is our argument ranging in order to be able to make those claims? So we might want to have a comparison between now and some period in the past and think very explicitly about when that would be. If, on the other hand, we can put the emphasis on the last word, is the Constitution still adequate for America's needs? That takes us in a quite different direction. And we might think, oh, well, what about, hopes, dreams, desires, and so on? And that would be a fun way into the question as well. So thinking about different sorts of comparators. Final question in this question of comparator class is, how far does the rural-urban divide in contemporary America threaten the operation of US democracy? Well, if we put our emphasis on rural-urban, we want to think about other sorts of divides within American politics. Of course, we all know about partisan polarization in the United States. We might want to think about racial polarization, religious divides, generational divides, education divides, and to contextualize a claim that we make about rural-urban divide vis-a-vis these other forms of division that we see, and think explicitly about how we can calibrate the extent of the rural-urban divide compared to these other forms of divide in American politics. Contemporary, again, takes us to that temporal comparison. How does it differ now compared to some period in the past, and be very explicit about what those temporal parameters are. And we might also put the emphasis at the end, the threat and the operation of US democracy. Well, what about thinking about the effect of the rural-urban divide with respect to democracy compared to other effects of the rural-urban divide, whether cultural, societal, technological, economic, and so on? There are many, many different ways of approaching these essays and thinking about these comparator classes, the phenomena, and as you're thinking about the empirical phenomena that you are explaining. You clearly can't take all of these directions, but I think that it's a very helpful way for us to get beyond mere description and to provide context, to provide a benchmark, and to organize our thinking about the empirical underpinning of our essays. So what I would urge you to do when you are thinking about the empirical underpinning of your essays is to think very explicitly about what your cases are doing for you. And there are several divides. There's two divides I'm going to talk to you about that I think really help to crystallize what it is that your empirical cases are doing for you. So one of them is the distinction between typical cases and telling cases. So a typical case is what we might think of as a representative case, right? So these are the cases where it's most easy to generalize to the broader population of which it's a part. It's supposed to stand in some way for the broader political phenomenon along some dimension of interest, right? And it might be that you have some statistics, some quantitative data that will tell you just how representative that case is. But that's not the only sort of case that we might be interested in a politics essay. We might also be interested in telling cases, which are extreme or unusual in some way. They're not necessarily representative. So if I were to ask you, how much power does the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court wield? Well, there have been 17 people who have held that office since the founding, and some of them leap to mind more readily than others. We might often think of Earl Warren, for example, who was the Chief Justice between 1953 and 1969, and he presided over this court that had so many absolute milestone landmark cases in civil rights, criminal procedure, one person, one vote, representation cases, and a whole host of others. And he himself was a very unusual Chief Justice in a lot of ways. He was extraordinary, a masterful agenda setter, opinion writer, and in lots of ways, really quite an unusual case, an unusual Chief Justice. So we'd think of him maybe as a telling case here. You might think, well, is there any such thing as a representative case in this instance? And I would have some sympathy with that view. But I think that there are ways in which we can consider in aggregate our cases and think more systematically about whether they are more typical cases or they're more extreme or unusual along the dimension that we're interested in. So we might group our cases chronologically, think about the time period in which the courts are operating. We might think about those courts that have operated during times of crisis, war, depression. We might think about the sort of situations in which courts are, the chief justices, let's say, are ideologically opposed to those who occupy the presidency or Congress. We might think about chief justices who preside over courts which have faced challenges to the court's independence, so court packing issues or enforcement and so on. There's all sorts of ways in which we can group those cases, but it's important, I think, to think about how representative are my cases. Are they unusual or are they more typical in another way? And then the second distinction, which I'm going to draw out for you, which I think is another helpful way to divide up your cases and think systematically about your empirics, is a distinction between easy and hard cases. So an easy case, which we as social scientists otherwise know as a most likely case, are those cases that we expect at the outset to conform to the pattern and to prove a thesis right. And then on the other hand, you've got these hard cases, which are kind of least likely cases. So they are the least likely to conform to our expectations, and they present a particularly difficult test for a hypothesis. And so both of those cases can play a role in your argument, right? You can, if you're not able to account even for easy cases, then your argument's in trouble. But if, on the other hand, you are able to account for cases that we think of as hard, then you are to that extent presenting a really persuasive argument. The example here is how adversarial are relations between Congress and the president. I don't know about you, but I mean, immediately Donald Trump leaps to mind. I think about him, we all think about him 24/7, right? But he's obviously, we're thinking about the Trump presidency as being one of particularly adversarial in the sense that there's in so many ways undermining congressional prerogatives, refusing to spend funds that have been appropriated by Congress, shuttering, dismantling agencies that have been authorized by Congress, keeping Congress in the dark, and so on. So we might think of Donald Trump as being a particularly easy case for establishing the proposition that relations between Congress and the president are adversarial. But, is the Trump case typical? I mean, how does that stack up in relation to other presidential congressional relations? So we might think about a harder case for the proposition that Congress and President are locked in a sort of adversarial relationship. If we think back to Lyndon Johnson, in the 1964, he's just won a landslide. He's got a Democratic Congress. They pass all these massive Great Society reforms, welfare, health, education, civil rights, and so on. Of course, he has to deal with segregationists in his own party. But, you might think of that as maybe a harder case for the proposition that the relations are adversarial. We might think at the outset that relations between Congress and the presidency would be more adversarial during times of divided government, where one party controls the presidency and the other party controls at least one house of Congress. And we might think, well, what would be a hard case there? Well, what about Ronald Reagan and the Democratic House of Representatives in his first term? They do an awful lot in terms of tax reform, in terms of Social Security reform, in terms of defense spending, and so on. So we might think of that as being a especially hard case for establishing the proposition that these relationships are adversarial indeed. So I think thinking really systematically about whether your empirical cases are typical or telling, easy or hard, is absolutely crucial to organising your thinking. So just to sum up, I would say the questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about your empirical contribution in your essay is to think really systematically about those cases. Of what is this a case compared to what? Is this a typical or a telling case? Is this a hard or an easy case? And that, I think, helps you to move beyond the news cycle and whatever just leaps to mind based on, we're all of us enmeshed in these and just completely captivated, I think, by the news cycle, but trying to think a bit more systematically about your empirical cases, making a really clear authoritative decision about where your essay is going, maybe achieving some sort of emotional distance also from your the sort of exhausting barrage of political news that we're all sort of thinking about, and writing something that's truly your own.